For Stirner, idleness represents freedom from external demands and duties, the ability to determine one's own purpose rather than serve an imposed cause. It is related to owning because by owning oneself, being master of oneself and will rather than possessed by some ideological or moral spook, one gains freedom to remain idle or inactive if one so chooses, rather than conforming to what some external system demands one ought to do. Some key connections between idleness, freedom and owning include: 1. The idle egoist has thrown off the imposition of all moral, political or religious absolutes that would determine purpose and instead follows only their own will. Their time and activity belong to themselves alone. This represents freedom through self-ownership. 2. By rejecting imposed duties to abstract ideals or absolutes beyond oneself, the egoist can avoid compulsively acting out of obedience to them and instead remain still and idle when they see no personal purpose or interest in activity. Their action springs from their own motivation, not commandments. Idleness signifies freedom from such commandments. 3. Only by owning oneself, being solely guided by one's own desires and will rather than seeking to fulfill externals' values as absolute ends in themselves, can one act on one's own reasons alone, including choosing idleness or inactivity when one pleases without guilt or shame. Self-ownership brings freedom from the need to justify purpose in terms of universal rules or duties. One's purpose is solely one's own. 4. The egoist recognizes that they alone determine meaning and purpose for themselves, rather than these being given from some beyond. So they need not remain in constant frantic activity, driven by a sense of duty to absolutes. They can rest idle and purposeless until stirred by motivation that they themselves own and recognize as their own. Their idleness confirms they act for their reasons alone. 5. Freedom means lack of external restraint or limits on action, but also lack of compulsion toward any particular action. By owning oneself instead of serving external masters with demands on one's purpose, the egoist gains freedom both to act as they choose, and not act when they do not so choose. Their idleness is as freely chosen as their activity. Both represent self-determination. So in short, idleness signifies freedom through owning oneself instead of being possessed by external purposes one feels a duty to serve. By rejecting imposed demands and absolutes, the egoist can act, or remain idle, for their own reasons alone, as their will alone determines. Their unwillingness to remain perpetually active out of obedience shows they have thrown off the rule of absolutes over them. They act only when and as they choose based on their desires, not commandments. Idleness becomes not a sin but a manifestation of radical freedom.